In a world of opulence and silent cruelty, a privileged bride-to-be, Evelyn, demands perfection for her wedding day. She forces her quiet, mistreated maid Lena to undertake the most critical task, sewing the intricate lacework for her bridal train and a last-minute veil. But as Lena's nimble fingers move with quiet fury, she weaves a powerful hidden truth into the fabric, an act of defiance that will soon be revealed to everyone at the wedding. If you liked the video and have subscribed to my channel, let's move on to our story. Enjoy watching. The light filtered through the ornate window panes of the great hall, illuminating the specks of dust that danced in the air like a million tiny, unburdened souls. Lena, however, felt the weight of every particle. Her hands, nimble and calloused from years of service, moved with practiced grace over a scrap of linen. It was a leftover from a botched tablecloth a month ago, but she saw a future in its threads. A new apron for Mrs. Perkins, the kind cook who always slipped her an extra potato at dinner. The work was a silent comfort, a language she understood far better than the clipped, imperious tones of the people who owned this house. Lena was a fixture of the Blaisdells estate, a shadow that moved with quiet purpose. To the Blaisdells, she was simply the help, a nameless part of the grand machinery that kept their lives running smoothly. She had been born on the grounds, her mother a laundress, her grandmother a scullery maid. The generations had woven themselves into the fabric of the Blaisdells' history, but in a way that left them invisible, like the backing on a priceless tapestry. Their labor was the foundation, but their faces were meant to be forgotten. The approaching wedding of Miss Evelyn Blaisdell had been a hurricane of activity for weeks. Evelyn, the only daughter, was a whirlwind of anxieties and demands. She was a creature of impulse and privilege, a perfectly polished stone that had never known the friction of true hardship. Her engagement to Sterling Crawford, a scion of a Chicago banking dynasty, was the social event of the season, and every detail had to be flawless. Lena heard the sharp tapping of heels on the polished marble floor and knew instantly who it was. The sound preceded Evelyn like a herald, announcing her arrival. Lena kept her head down, her needle pulling the thread in a smooth, rhythmic motion. "Lena, there you are." Evelyn's voice was high and petulant. She never used Lena's name unless she needed something, and the tone was less a greeting and more an assertion of ownership. Lena set her work aside, her hands resting in her lap. "Good morning, Miss Evelyn," she said, her voice soft and even. Evelyn didn't respond to the pleasantry. She held up a length of white silk, an exquisite fabric that shimmered with a pearlescent sheen. It was a sample for her wedding dress, one of a dozen. "This is all wrong," she declared, her lip curling in disgust. "The designer, that French idiot, said it was the best silk. It's like a cheap sheet. I told Mother 1,000 times, we should have gone to Milan, not Paris." Lena remained silent. Evelyn didn't expect a response, only an audience. She continued her tirade, pacing the length of the hall. "Mother thinks I'm being hysterical, but the whole wedding hinges on this dress. Sterling's cousin is coming all the way from London, and she's a fashion editor. It has to be perfect." She stopped abruptly in front of Lena, her gaze finally settling on her, not as a person but as a potential solution. "You're good with a needle, aren't you?" she said, the question more of a statement. Lena nodded slowly. "I suppose so, Miss Evelyn." Evelyn dropped the fabric on Lena's lap. It felt impossibly soft and cold against her rough hands. "The French fool is taking too long to find the proper material. He keeps sending these off-white things. It's too late to commission anyone else. And Mother insists that the lace on the train must be hand-stitched. She says it's tradition, but it's a nightmare. The seamstresses we've hired are slow, incompetent. Not like you, I suppose. I've seen what you do with a needle." Evelyn's voice lowered to a conspiratorial whisper, as if sharing a secret. "You don't have any other pressing duties, do you?" The question was rhetorical. Lena's duties were constant and endless, a list of chores that stretched from dawn to dusk. I have my chores, Miss Evelyn," Lena said, her heart beginning to pound with a quiet dread. She knew where this was going. Yes, the house can wait. You will sew the train. You'll work on it every day after your other duties are complete. Mother said it will keep you busy." The last part was spoken with a sort of careless finality. The request, as casual as it was, felt like a noose tightening around her neck. Evelyn was not asking. She was commanding. And this wasn't just any task. It was the most important element of the Blaisdell Crawford wedding. The weight of the world, or at least Evelyn's world, was now resting on Lena's shoulders. Her hands moved over the silk, feeling its impossible softness. She imagined the intricate lacework she would have to attach, the thousands of delicate stitches that would go into creating the bridal train. It was an overwhelming project, and it would be done on top of her already grueling schedule with no extra pay, of course. "I don't know if I can do that, Miss Evelyn," Lena said, her voice barely above a whisper. Evelyn's eyes narrowed. "Don't you dare tell me you can't. You will do it, and you will do it perfectly. My wedding dress is a reflection of me, and I won't have it be a mess because of your laziness." She added a final, cutting remark. "Don't you want to be useful for once in your life?" The words hung in the air, a familiar sting that Lena had learned to endure. She felt a knot tighten in her stomach, but she swallowed the bitterness and simply nodded. "Yes, Miss Evelyn." Evelyn's mother, Mrs. Blaisdells, entered the hall, her arms filled with stacks of wedding invitations. She saw Evelyn's agitated expression and the silk in Lena's hands. "What's this, Evelyn? Is she going to help you?" "Yes, Mother. She's going to do the lacework on the train." The idiot designer said it was a traditional hand-stitched process, and Lena seems to be the only one who can be trusted to not ruin it. Mrs. Blaisdell sighed. "Good. We don't need any more delays. Just be sure she doesn't mark it. You know how clumsy they can be." Her gaze swept over Lena, a look that was both dismissive and vaguely suspicious, as if Lena were a child playing with fire. It was a look Lena knew well. It was the look that said her hands, no matter how skilled, were still seen as less worthy, less clean, simply because of the color of her skin. The words were an unspoken rule, a part of the air she breathed in this house. The casual cruelty, the effortless racism, it was a constant low-level hum. To them it wasn't an insult, it was a simple fact of life, an observation. Lena's worth was measured not by her talent, but by the convenience she provided to them. Left alone with the shimmering silk and the heavy lace, Lena felt a wave of despair. This was a project of immense pressure and consequence, one she would be blamed for if it went wrong, and given no credit for if it was a success. She picked up the fabric, the threads feeling less like raw material and more like a set of impossible expectations. The loom of fate, it seemed, was beginning to weave a very difficult pattern for her. But as she began to unfurl the fabric, her fingers traced a single delicate rose in the lace, and a spark of an idea began to flicker to life. The Blaisdells might see her as a nameless tool, but she had a gift and she had a choice in how she used it. She would sew the dress, yes, but she would do it on her own terms. The days bled into each other, marked only by the shifting light in the sewing room and the progress of the intricate lacework. The silk bridal train, which had once felt impossibly soft and distant, was now a constant, unforgiving presence. Lena's fingers, once merely nimble, were now raw and pricked. She worked from the moment her chores were done until well past midnight, the only sound in the silent house the gentle hum of the gas lamps and the whisper of her needle through the fine fabric. Evelyn, meanwhile, flitted in and out of the sewing room like a hummingbird, her visits always preceded by the scent of expensive perfume and followed by a trail of dissatisfaction. "Is that all you've done?" she'd ask, her tone laced with impatience as she looked at the barely there progress. "I need you to work faster, Lena. Sterling's mother arrives tomorrow. She's a perfectionist." Evelyn had a way of speaking that made Lena feel like a machine, a tool to be pushed to its limits. One afternoon, Evelyn came in, a small, polished smile on her face. She was holding a tray with a glass of lemonade, ice tinkling against the rim. Lena's throat was parched. She hadn't had a sip of water in hours. Her eyes went to the glass, but Evelyn didn't offer it. She walked to the window, placed the tray on the sill, and began to admire the garden. "I heard you were feeling a bit tired," Evelyn said, her voice dripping with an insincere sympathy. "Mother told me not to push you so hard, but honestly, Lena, there's no time for rest. The wedding is in 2 weeks." She picked up the glass, took a slow, deliberate sip, and set it back down half empty. The cold condensation on the glass left a perfect ring on the wood. Lena swallowed hard and kept her eyes on her work, her hands moving as if on their own. The glass remained on the sill, a taunting mirage of relief. It was a small gesture, but it was a perfect summary of her life here. Existence in the presence of comfort without the possibility of partaking in it. The next day, Sterling's mother, Mrs. Crawford, arrived. She was a woman of impeccable taste and withering glances. She surveyed the Blaisdell estate with an air of detached judgment, her gaze lingering on a chipped piece of plaster or a slightly crooked painting. When she was shown the sewing room, she looked at Lena with an expression that was both curious and clinical, as if she were inspecting a rare, exotic bird. "So this is the girl," she said to Mrs. Blaisdell, her voice a low, musical rumble. "You've found someone to do the handwork. Marvelous. That's such a lost art." Mrs. Blaisdell preened. "Lena has been with us for years. Her family, in fact. They're quite skilled with their hands." Mrs. Crawford nodded slowly, her eyes still on Lena. "I can see that. The stitches are exquisite. But one must be careful with such dedicated workers. They can get distracted easily. Best to keep them focused on the task at hand." Lena felt a blush creep up her neck, a hot, shameful wave. The words were not meant to be offensive, but they were filled with a condescending tone that was far more painful than outright insults. They saw her, but only as an extension of her work. She was a tool, not a human being with thoughts, feelings, or a will of her own. She was a quiet, obedient hand and nothing more. Evelyn's fiancé, Sterling, was a different sort of man altogether. He was charming, handsome, and seemed utterly oblivious to the undercurrents of the house. He treated everyone with the same pleasant, detached politeness. He would often pass the sewing room and offer a friendly smile to Lena. To him, she was just another part of the household, a face he had seen since he was a child visiting the estate. He was a man of good manners but no genuine interest beyond his own sphere. He once saw Lena's work, a small embroidered bird she had been working on in her spare time. "That's beautiful, Lena," he said, a look of genuine surprise on his face. "You should be a proper artist. That is, if you weren't so busy with other things." The words were meant as a compliment, but they stung. The unspoken truth was that her place in the world was fixed. She couldn't be an artist, a creator, not in the way he meant. Her station in life was set, and the idea of her rising above it was a pleasant fantasy for him to mention in passing, but not a reality he would ever truly consider. As the wedding day drew closer, the pressure intensified. The last few yards of the train were a masterpiece of complex floral patterns and delicate beading. Lena's fingers were now perpetually sore, her back ached from hunching over the work for hours on end, and her eyes were constantly strained from the meticulous work. She had been given the wrong shade of thread for a portion of the lace, a small but noticeable detail. When she pointed it out, Evelyn exploded. "Are you blind, Lena? It's not even close. It's a completely different shade of white. You've ruined it. Do you have any idea how expensive this lace is?" Lena had to go back and painstakingly undo hours of work, her heart sinking with every snip of the thread. She worked even later that night, her mind and body a blur of exhaustion. Her small room in the servants' quarters became a sanctuary only for sleep, the hours spent on the dress taking away all her spare moments. On one of her late-night sessions, she heard a soft knock on the sewing room door. It was Mrs. Perkins, the cook, holding a small plate with a slice of bread and a cup of warm milk. "You're still at it, child?" Mrs. Perkins said, her voice a low, motherly murmur. "You'll work yourself to death. Here, eat. You need the strength." Lena's eyes welled up with tears of gratitude. She took the food, her hands shaking slightly. "Thank you, Mrs. Perkins. I don't know what I would do without you." The cook sat with her for a moment, silent. "They take what they want," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They don't see you, not really. They just see the things you can do for them." Lena finished her work, the last stitch a small, perfect knot. She laid out the dress on the long table, the full, flowing train a shimmering river of silk and lace. It was breathtaking. The hand-stitched lacework was a testament to her skill and dedication, a tapestry of intricate flowers and leaves that seemed to glow in the dim light. She had worked miracles, turning Evelyn's demanding vision into a tangible reality, and in the process she had poured a piece of herself into every thread. Just as she was about to leave for the night, Evelyn burst into the room, her face pale with panic. "Mother, you won't believe it. The dress, the stupid French man sent the wrong veil. It's a total disaster and the wedding is tomorrow," she shrieked. Evelyn's eyes, wild with panic, landed on the finished dress train and then on Lena. A slow, calculating expression replaced the panic. She stared at Lena's weary hands, a new, terrible idea dawning in her mind. "Lena, you'll fix it. You'll create a new veil tonight. It will be the perfect complement to the dress." Lena's heart sank. She had been up for days running on pure adrenaline. The thought of starting a new project, a new challenge in the few remaining hours before the wedding seemed like a cruel joke. But she saw the look on Evelyn's face, a look of unwavering certainty, and she knew there was no saying no. The grand wedding was just hours away, and the final demand had been made. The world outside the sewing room was a quiet hum of preparation, but inside, a silent war was being waged. Lena worked with a singular, desperate focus. The grand clock in the hall had long since struck midnight, then one, then two, its chimes a relentless march toward an impossible deadline. She had been given a single bolt of the finest white tulle, its delicate weave so fragile it felt like woven air. Evelyn had thrown it at her with a final, exasperated demand: "Just make something. I don't care what, just don't let me look like a fool." Evelyn's words, intended as a last, cutting blow, had instead ignited a new kind of resolve in Lena. For weeks she had been a machine, a nameless hand following orders. She had stitched every thread with the unspoken pain of her position, the casual cruelty, the invisible weight of being the help. But now, with the clock ticking and her body screaming for rest, she was no longer a tool. She was a creator, and this veil would be her masterpiece. It would be her voice. She began to work, not with the frantic desperation Evelyn expected, but with a quiet, furious calm. The ideas came to her in a rush, a silent conversation between her hands and the fabric. She would not just sew a veil, she would tell a story. She would tell her story. She took the extra silk and lace from the wedding gown and, instead of the traditional floral patterns Evelyn would have expected, she began to stitch. The base of the veil was a simple, elegant cascade of tulle, but the embroidery she wove into it was anything but. She started with the rose from the lace on the gown's train, making it a central motif. But she didn't just stitch a single, perfect flower. She created a winding vine, the rose at its center, with thorns that were almost imperceptible, stitched with a single dark thread. The thorns were a whisper of pain, a hidden truth. Next, she began to weave a pattern of hands, but not the graceful, delicate hands of a bride. These were different. They were strong with long, slender fingers. Some were wrapped around a tiny needle, others cradled a steaming teacup. There were hands holding a laundry basket, and hands smoothing the hem of a dress. She didn't use bold, obvious threads for this. The images were subtle, almost ghostly, woven in shades of white on white, so that they were only visible from a certain angle, under a certain light. A casual glance would see only an intricate, beautiful pattern, but a closer look would reveal the truth, the silent, tireless labor of generations. She worked feverishly, her fingers a blur of motion. She wove in tiny, almost invisible butterflies, each one meticulously crafted with silver thread. To a casual observer, they were a beautiful, whimsical detail. To Lena, they were a symbol of her spirit, of the small dreams she harbored in the dark. Below them, near the hem, she stitched an intricate, swirling pattern that looked like a bird taking flight. She didn't use the bright, celebratory colors Evelyn would have chosen. Instead, she used a quiet, beautiful gold thread, a hidden beacon of hope. As the sun began to rise, painting the sky in a soft, ethereal gray, Lena laid out the finished veil. Her body ached, her eyes burned, but the fatigue was replaced by a deep, profound sense of peace. The veil was not just a piece of fabric. It was a testament to her quiet strength, her resilience, and the dignity that they had tried so hard to deny her. It was a secret, whispered history, woven into the very fabric of the day's celebration. The wedding day dawned bright and clear, a perfect storybook day. The grand hall was transformed into a paradise of white roses and shimmering silk. Guests arrived in a procession of horse-drawn carriages and shiny automobiles, their laughter echoing through the manicured gardens. Evelyn, a vision of pre-wedding nerves and excitement, paced her private chambers, her mother hovering nearby, fretting over every detail. Finally, the moment came for Evelyn to put on her veil. She had been so consumed with panic that she hadn't even bothered to look at it. She simply held it out to her maid of honor. But as the maid of honor unfolded the delicate tulle, a gasp escaped her lips. "Oh, Evelyn. It's breathtaking," she whispered. "It's not what I would have expected, but it's so unique." Evelyn turned, her eyes wide with curiosity, and looked at her reflection. She saw a cascade of light and shadow, the veil falling in perfect folds around her face. The lace from her gown and the tulle veil complemented each other flawlessly. She looked at the intricate, detailed embroidery and a slow smile spread across her face. It was magnificent. The subtle white-on-white embroidery, which Lena had so painstakingly created, was beautiful, elegant, and unlike any other veil she had ever seen. She had been right to trust her instincts to let Lena handle the task. As Evelyn made her way down the aisle, the guests murmured in admiration. The dress was a triumph, but the veil was an unexpected, stunning masterpiece. The light from the great hall windows caught the subtle gold threads of the flying bird, making it glint like a hidden star. The hands, stitched with such care, looked like delicate, artistic patterns. Mrs. Crawford, with her keen eye for detail, was the first to recognize the unique quality of the lacework. She leaned over to Mrs. Blaisdell and whispered, "My goodness, what a marvelous choice. The intricate lacework on the veil, it's a whole different style. It's absolutely captivating." Mrs. Blaisdell beamed, a proud, satisfied smile on her face. She took full credit for the idea, a final, self-serving victory. The ceremony began, the words of the officiant echoing through the silent hall. Everything was perfect. But as Evelyn stood at the altar, surrounded by her family and her new husband, the light from the stained glass window behind her shifted. The sun, having reached its peak, cast a warm, direct glow on the back of her veil. Suddenly, the subtle, white-on-white embroidery came into sharp focus, revealing the hidden story within. A gasp, quiet at first, spread through the first few rows of the guests. Evelyn's aunt, a shrewd and observant woman, squinted, then pointed with a trembling finger. Mrs. Blaisdell, a smile still on her face, turned to look at the veil and her face went ashen. She saw the hands of a laundress, a servant, a scullery maid, woven into the fabric of her daughter's triumph. She saw the tiny, almost invisible thorns on the roses. She saw the bird in flight, a symbol of freedom that had no place on her daughter's veil. The Blaisdells had demanded a symbol of their wealth and status. They had used Lena, stripped of her humanity, to create a perfect dress. But Lena, with nothing but her own talent and a quiet strength, had turned their symbol of privilege into an unspoken accusation. She had sewn not just a veil but the truth. The Blaisdells had gotten their perfect dress, but they also got a piece of history they would have preferred to keep hidden. And it was all on display for everyone to see. The perfect wedding day was now a canvas for their darkest secrets. A hush, thick and suffocating, descended upon the pews. It began with the first quiet gasp and spread like a ripple, a silent wave of recognition and judgment. The murmuring that had celebrated the bride's gown a moment before now shifted to a low, disquieted hum. All eyes were not on Evelyn's radiant face, but on the back of her veil, where the mid-morning sun had illuminated a story she had no idea she was wearing. The guests, a society of people who lived and breathed innuendo and social codes, understood the symbolism instantly. They saw the ghostly hands of labor, the subtle thorns, the defiant, winged creature. It was a scandal stitched in silk. Mrs. Blaisdell's face, a mask of serene pride just moments ago, was now a portrait of mortification. She clutched her husband's arm, her perfectly manicured fingers digging into the fabric of his suit. "Charles, did you see that?" she hissed, the words barely audible. Mr. Blaisdell, a man whose entire life was built on carefully constructed appearances, could only stare, his jaw slack. The veil was supposed to be a testament to their wealth and heritage, a grand, flawless finale. Instead, it was an artful act of rebellion. The audacity of it, the quiet, furious genius of the betrayal, was what truly stunned them. Evelyn, standing at the altar, felt the change in the atmosphere. The auras of admiration had been replaced by a sharp, collective intake of breath, a sudden tension that made her skin prickle. She glanced at Sterling, who was looking past her, his brows furrowed in confusion. He was a man of business and numbers, not of art or subtlety. He saw the intricate patterns, but he did not yet grasp their meaning. Her maid of honor, who had seen the detail up close in the dressing room, was now pale, her eyes wide as she finally understood the hidden imagery. From her vantage point in the choir loft, Lena watched it all unfold. She was a silent spectator in a play she had written. The quiet rustle of the guests, the frantic whispers, the looks of shock and understanding, it was all a symphony to her ears. She felt no malice, only a profound sense of justice. For weeks, she had been invisible, her talent taken for granted, her humanity dismissed. Now she was seen. Her hands, so often a subject of dismissal, had spoken a truth louder than any shouted accusation. This was not an act of revenge, but an act of reclamation. She had taken back her dignity, one stitch at a time. Down below, Mrs. Blaisdell began to regain her composure, her mind working furiously to contain the damage. She leaned toward Sterling's mother, Mrs. Crawford, and forced a thin, strained smile. "A bit of modern art," she murmured, as if the veil were an avant-garde design choice. "Evelyn can be so creative." Mrs. Crawford, however, was not fooled. Her face was impassive, but her eyes held a chilling knowledge. She had seen the embroidered hands, the thorns, the silent protest. She looked at Mrs. Blaisdell, and for a long moment, there was no sound between them. It was a silent conversation, a recognition of a terrible, unspoken truth. This was not a fashion statement. It was an insult, a stain on the Blaisdells' polished reputation. Suddenly, a loud, clear voice broke the silence. It was Sterling. He looked at Evelyn, who was staring at him in panicked confusion. He then looked at the wedding guests, at the shocked and murmuring faces. With a quiet grace that surprised everyone, he reached out and gently lifted the veil from Evelyn's hair. He draped it carefully over his arm, turning his back to the altar for a moment, and laid it on a velvet cushion. The embroidered story, which had been so vividly on display, was now folded away, hidden from view. Evelyn stared at him, bewildered. He simply smiled, a genuine, reassuring smile that reached his eyes. "You are radiant enough on your own, my love," he said, his voice carrying through the hall. "You don't need a veil to tell the world how beautiful you are." His words, a masterstroke of diplomacy, salvaged the moment. The tension eased slightly. The guests, ever eager for a good show, had been denied the climax of a public scandal. Instead, they were left to wonder about the hidden meaning behind the veil and the motives of the creative seamstress. The rest of the ceremony proceeded, but the perfect, storybook quality was gone. An undercurrent of unease lingered, a silent question mark hanging in the air. The Blaisdells wore fixed, strained smiles, their eyes darting nervously to the guests, trying to gauge what had been seen, what had been understood. As the wedding party made its way to the reception, Mrs. Blaisdell pulled her husband aside, her voice a low, furious whisper. "Get Lena. No. I want her in my office. We will deal with this insubordination." The word, spoken with such venom, was a promise of retribution. She knew exactly what Lena had done, and she would not let this act of rebellion go unpunished. Lena, her heart a drumbeat in her chest, had already made her way down from the loft. She walked not with defiance but with a quiet dignity. The Blaisdells had demanded her labor and her skill, and she had given it to them in her own way. She had sown a truth they had tried to bury. She was no longer a shadow but a witness, and she was ready for what was to come. She knew she was in trouble, that her future here, perhaps even her safety, was in jeopardy. But as she walked toward the back door, she didn't feel fear. She felt pride. The walk to the Blaisdell family office felt longer than any journey Lena had ever taken. The air in the house, once merely still and quiet, now thrummed with a vengeful energy. The sounds of the reception, the lilting music, the chinking of champagne glasses, the distant, polite laughter, seemed to mock the solemnity of her path. She passed by a maid carrying a platter of exquisite canapés and another polishing a silver vase. They looked at her with pity and fear, their eyes full of a silent warning. They knew what a summons to the office meant for someone of their station. Mrs. Blaisdell's office was a room of dark mahogany and heavy leather, a space that smelled of old money, cigar smoke, and sealed documents. It was a room where decisions were made, not questioned. Mrs. Blaisdell stood before the imposing fireplace, her back to the crackling flames, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles were white. Her face, a mask of controlled fury, was a sight Lena had never seen before. Her casual cruelty had always been a matter of effortless dismissal, not of open-faced rage. This was a new and terrifying thing born of public embarrassment. "Come in, Lena," Mrs. Blaisdell said, her voice a dangerous calm. The door swung shut behind Lena with a heavy thud, sealing her in. Lena stood in the center of the room, her hands folded in front of her. She did not lower her gaze. She looked directly at Mrs. Blaisdell, the fatigue of days of sleepless work etched into her features, but her posture was one of unshakable dignity. "I believe you have some explaining to do," Mrs. Blaisdell began, her voice rising in pitch. "My daughter's wedding, the most important day of her life, and you choose that moment to make a mockery of my family. What you did with that veil was an act of deliberate malice. An act of rebellion." "It was not rebellion, ma'am," Lena said, her voice steady. It was a gift. The words seemed to hit Mrs. Blaisdell with the force of a physical blow. She recoiled slightly, her composure cracking. A gift? What insolence! You made us the laughingstock of the city's elite. The entire reception is buzzing with questions. Mrs. Crawford herself asked me, who is the artist behind that interesting choice? She spat the word artist as if it were a curse. The hands on that veil are my mother's, Lena continued, ignoring the outburst. And my grandmother's. And mine. They are the hands that have served this family for generations. The hands that have cooked your meals, laundered your clothes, and polished your silver. I wove them into the fabric because they are a part of your history, whether you choose to acknowledge it or not. Mrs. Blaisdell's face contorted with disbelief and rage. How dare you? You were commissioned to sew a veil, not to tell a story. You have overstepped your place, Lena, in a way that is simply unforgivable. She walked toward Lena, the polished mahogany desk between them, her eyes like chips of ice. You think you are an artist? You are the hired help. Your purpose is to be useful, not to be seen. You should be grateful for the roof over your head and the food in your stomach. I am grateful, ma'am, Lena replied, her voice still without a tremor. But gratitude does not erase the truth. I worked for weeks, from dawn until the early hours of the morning. I was given little rest and no recognition. I was spoken to as if I were less than a person. The thorns I wove into the roses were the thorns I felt every day. The admission hung in the air, a final, unassailable piece of evidence. Mrs. Blaisdell, for the first time, seemed to be at a loss for words. She had expected fear, tears, and apology. She had expected to have the upper hand, to crush this defiance with a few withering words. Instead, she was faced with a quiet, undeniable truth. The hands, they were a tribute, Lena said, her voice softening slightly. I have seen them work miracles. Your family's legacy is built on the strength of those hands. It seemed to me only right that they should be a part of your daughter's celebration. The veil was for you, ma'am. A gift of remembrance. The audacity of it, the unexpected kindness woven into the accusation, rendered Mrs. Blaisdell speechless. Lena had taken the weapon of her shame and reframed it as a gesture of profound, and profoundly unwanted generosity. The gesture was 1,000 times more powerful than any act of revenge. It was a mirror, and Mrs. Blaisdell did not like what she saw in it. Finally, Mrs. Blaisdell found her voice again, though it was now trembling with a suppressed rage that was far more dangerous than her earlier fury. You are finished here, Lena, she said, her words clipped and final. You will pack your things and leave this house tonight. You will not return. Your family will be informed that your services are no longer required. Lena nodded slowly as if she had expected this. Yes, ma'am. And the veil, Mrs. Blaisdell added, her gaze falling on a small silver tray, where a single glass of untouched water still sat. It will be burned. So that no one will ever see this affront again. So that your lesson is learned and you understand your place. Lena's eyes flickered toward the veil, which was presumably still at the reception. But she did not respond. She had given her gift. It did not matter what they did with it now. The truth had already been seen. It was in the minds of the guests, a story whispered from one to another, a permanent stain on the Blaisdells' perfect day. The dress, the symbol of their triumph, would forever carry a hidden scar, a reminder of the quiet rebellion of the woman who sewed it. Lena turned and walked toward the door, leaving Mrs. Blaisdell alone in the silent, dark room, the fire in the hearth a metaphor for her burning rage and the ashes of her perfect day. The cool night air was a shock to Lena's system, a cleansing breath after the suffocating heat of the Blaisdell office. She carried a single worn satchel, its contents a testament to a life lived in a state of quiet impermanence. 2 spare dresses, a threadbare shawl, a small faded photograph of her mother, and the few coins she had managed to save over the years. The satchel was light, but the feeling of freedom that came with it was a heavy, exhilarating weight. She was walking away from a place she had called home her entire life, a place where she had been a ghost, a tool, a nameless shadow. Now, in the darkness, she felt more solid and real than she ever had before. She walked the familiar path that led away from the servants' quarters, past the great kitchen where Mrs. Perkins would be cleaning up, and toward the iron gates that marked the boundary of the Blaisdell estate. The gates, so imposing and unbreachable in the past, now felt insignificant. She pushed through them without a second thought, the squeal of the hinges a protest against her escape. On the other side, the road stretched out, a ribbon of pale moonlight, leading into an uncertain future. She did not know where she would sleep or what she would do tomorrow, but for the first time the future was her own to shape. Back in the grand ballroom, the veneer of perfection had completely shattered. The polite chatter of the guests was replaced with a low, conspiratorial buzz. People glanced toward the Blaisdells and then toward the empty space where the veil had been, their expressions a mix of amusement and judgment. A good scandal was better than any champagne, and the Blaisdells had just provided the society event of the season with a story that would be whispered about for years. Mrs. Blaisdell, her face a rigid mask of fury, cornered Evelyn in a quiet corner of the room. "How could you be so careless? That girl, that servant, has disgraced our family. The Crawfords are furious. Mrs. Crawford is looking at me as if I were a common criminal." Evelyn, still bewildered by the abrupt change in her perfect day, could only stammer, "I don't understand, Mother. The veil was beautiful. What was wrong with it?" Mrs. Blaisdell leaned in close, her voice a poisonous whisper. "Look closer, you fool. Do you not see the hands? The hands of the help, Evelyn. The hands of laundresses and cooks. She stitched her entire family history onto your wedding veil. It's an affront. A public act of defiance. Do you know what people are saying? They're saying we treat our servants so poorly that they had to resort to such a public spectacle to protest. My reputation, your father's business connections, it's all in jeopardy." Evelyn's face went pale as she finally understood. The veil she had thought so beautiful was a secret indictment. She felt a wave of shame and betrayal wash over her. She looked across the room at Sterling, who was standing with his parents, his expression unreadable. She had wanted this day to be perfect, a reflection of her status and her happiness, and now it was a stage for a silent, furious protest she hadn't even known was being waged. Later that night, when the last of the guests had departed and the house was eerily silent, Evelyn found Sterling in his study, a glass of brandy in his hand. He was not angry, but he was distant, thoughtful. "Sterling, I am so sorry," Evelyn began, her voice small. "I didn't know. I never looked at it closely." Sterling turned, his expression pensive. "I didn't either at first. But my mother, she noticed it immediately. She asked me, 'Who is the hand that sewed such a tale?' She found it rather bold." He took a sip of his brandy, his gaze fixed on the dying embers in the fireplace. "She's not angry, Evelyn. She's intrigued." She said it showed a sort of genius. A quiet, powerful dignity that our kind of people rarely possess. Evelyn was stunned. She had expected him to be furious, to blame her for the scandal. Instead, he seemed to be admiring the very thing her mother wanted to burn. "I heard your mother tell Lena that the veil will be burned," Sterling said, his voice flat. "Is that true?" Evelyn nodded miserably. "Mother is terrified of the talk. She says it's the only way to get rid of it." Sterling set his glass down. "She is mistaken. You cannot burn a truth once it's been seen. It has already been etched into everyone's memory. Burning the veil would only confirm that you were embarrassed by what it said, that you were afraid of the truth. It would make the scandal 1,000 times worse." Meanwhile, Lena had made her way to the far side of town, to a small cottage tucked away on a cobblestone alley. It was the home of Mrs. Perkins, the kind cook, and her family. Mrs. Perkins, a woman of deep and abiding loyalties, had heard the rumors and had been waiting for her. She pulled Lena inside, her arms wrapping around her in a fierce, comforting embrace. "Oh, child," she murmured, tears in her eyes. "I heard what you did. I knew it was coming. Bless you for having such courage. It was the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." Lena spent the night in a small, clean room, the scent of fresh-baked bread a soothing comfort. For the first time in her life she was a guest, not a servant. The next day she sat in the small garden, her hands finally still, her mind at peace. The sun was warm on her face, and the sounds of the city were a vibrant, living symphony. Suddenly a knock came at the door. It was a young boy from the Blaisdell estate, a kitchen servant with a message. He held a large, wrapped bundle in his arms. "Lena," he said, his voice hushed. "I was told to deliver this to you." Lena took the package, her heart pounding with a familiar dread. Was it a final, cruel message from Mrs. Blaisdell? She unwrapped the cloth to reveal a glimmer of white silk and tulle. It was the veil. It had not been burned. A small note was tucked into the folds. It wasn't signed, but the handwriting was elegant and refined. Do not burn a truth. It will only make it stronger. Your work is a masterpiece. Keep it. Do not let them take your story. Lena looked at the boy, but he simply shook his head. I was just told to bring it here. No one knows I'm here. Not even Mrs. Blaisdell. The veil was now in her hands, a final, beautiful testament to her defiance. It was not a symbol of their shame, but of her strength. She held it, her fingers tracing the hidden hands and the flying bird, and in that moment she realized she had not just lost a job. She had gained a future. A future where her hands and her art would be her own. A future where she would no longer be a shadow in someone else's story, but the author of her own. The morning sun, so often a herald of a new day of thankless toil, now felt different to Lena. It was a warmth on her face as she sat in the small sun-drenched garden behind Mrs. Perkins's cottage, the veil from Evelyn Blaisdell's wedding resting gently on her lap. The note from Sterling, an unexpected act of rebellion from a man of privilege, lay folded beside it. His words, "Do not burn a truth. It will only make it stronger. Your work is a masterpiece," resonated deep within her. The veil was no longer a piece of a story that wasn't hers. It was a testament to her talent, a symbol of her quiet power. For the first time in her life, Lena felt the true weight of her own agency. She had no job, no roof over her head, and no certainty of her next meal, but she was free. And she had her hands. She had always worked for others, but now she would work for herself. She took the last of her meager savings, the coins she had carefully hoarded over the years, and bought a bolt of plain muslin, a spool of cotton thread, and a handful of needles from a small local haberdashery. She did not need the finest silk or the most delicate lace. Her art was not about the material, it was about the story she could weave into it. Her first pieces were small, quiet creations. She embroidered a single, perfect lily on a simple handkerchief for Mrs. Perkins, the flower's petals so lifelike they seemed to unfurl in the morning breeze. She made a sampler of a mother bird feeding its young for the woman who ran the local bakery. She didn't charge much, only enough to buy more thread and more muslin. She didn't seek out customers, she let her work speak for itself, relying on the quiet, unwritten network of the working class. Mrs. Perkins, her greatest advocate, would discreetly show the pieces to her friends and fellow servants, whispering the tale of the Blaisdell veil. The story of the woman who sewed the truth spread like wildfire, a silent legend whispered from kitchen to kitchen, from alleyway to alleyway. Soon the small orders began to multiply. A grocer's wife wanted a tablecloth with a pattern of ripe fruits. A dressmaker asked for a child's dress with embroidered butterflies. Lena's hands, once toiling in obscurity, now created with purpose and joy. She was not just a seamstress, she was a storyteller. She wove the lives of her clients into her work, the grocer's harvest, the dressmaker's youthful hopes. Each piece was unique, each a tangible testament to her talent. She was no longer a shadow, she was a creator, and her reputation, though still a secret from the upper class, grew by the day. Meanwhile, the Blaisdells' perfect wedding day had become the scandal of the year. The society pages hinted at a fashionable faux pas and a subtle artistic statement, but the truth once seen could not be unseen. Mrs. Crawford, with her keen eye for detail and her unyielding intelligence, was the only one who truly understood the depth of the veiled protest. While the Blaisdells fumed and tried to contain the damage, Mrs. Crawford was intrigued. She knew that such a powerful and artful act was not the work of a disgruntled servant, it was the work of a true artist. She began to discreetly inquire, using her considerable influence to find the creator. She did not ask the Blaisdells, she knew they would only lie or lash out. Instead, she asked the housekeepers, the maids, the stable hands. She had a way of speaking to them that was entirely different from the Blaisdells. She looked them in the eye, she used their names, and she treated them with a quiet respect that disarmed their natural wariness. Slowly, the whispered trail of rumors led her from one person to another, to the kind cook at the Blaisdell estate, Mrs. Perkins. One afternoon, a polished carriage with a liveried driver stopped in the small alley where Mrs. Perkins's cottage was nestled. Mrs. Perkins, having seen too many similar carriages in her life, came to the door, her face a mask of polite caution. A woman stepped out, dressed in a simple but impossibly elegant suit. She had a face that was both severe and kind, and her eyes missed nothing. "Mrs. Perkins?" the woman asked, her voice a low, musical rumble. "Yes, ma'am," Mrs. Perkins replied, her hand clutching the doorframe. "My name is Mrs. Crawford," the woman said. "I believe you may know a seamstress, a young woman with a talent for telling stories with her needle." She did not use Lena's name, but the message was clear. Mrs. Perkins's heart pounded. She looked from Mrs. Crawford's face to the imposing carriage, her mind racing. This was a Blaisdell wedding guest. Was this a new kind of retribution? "I'm sorry, ma'am, I don't know who you are talking about," she said, her voice strained. Just then Lena emerged from the garden, a small embroidered linen in her hands. She saw the carriage and the elegant woman standing at the door. Her breath caught in her throat. She had faced Mrs. Blaisdell's rage, but this was a different, more chilling kind of power. Mrs. Crawford's eyes found Lena, and they did not hold the condescension of a Blaisdell. They held a look of recognition, of admiration. A long silence stretched between the three women. "Lena, is it?" Mrs. Crawford finally said, a small, genuine smile touching her lips. "I have been looking for you. I must say your work is a masterpiece. That veil, it was a profound work of art. My son told me you would not let them burn your story, and I am here to ensure that you never have to again." She looked at Mrs. Perkins, then back at Lena, her gaze unwavering. "I am a collector of art, and I have never seen a talent quite like yours. I'm not here to punish you. I am here to offer you a partnership. A proper workshop, a proper living. Your work deserves to be seen, Lena, on its own terms. Not as a protest, but as a creation." The offer hung in the air, a breathtaking proposition. It was not a handout or a charitable gesture or a simple job. It was a chance for Lena to step out of the shadows and into the light, with the support of a woman who saw her not as a servant, but as an equal. The decision was no longer just about survival, it was about her future and the future of her art. The moment was a turning point, a silent crossroads where two paths diverged. For Lena, the choice was not one of hesitation, but of destiny. She looked at Mrs. Crawford, this elegant woman who saw her not as a servant, but as a creator, and a deep, unfamiliar sense of hope bloomed in her chest. She had nothing to lose and a world to gain. "Yes, ma'am," Lena said, her voice clear and strong. "I accept." Mrs. Crawford nodded, a small, knowing smile on her lips, as if the answer had been decided long ago. Lena spent the next few days in a whirlwind of new beginnings. With the kind but firm guidance of Mrs. Crawford's assistant, she was moved from Mrs. Perkins's humble cottage to a small, sunlit workshop in a quiet corner of the city. The space was a revelation, an entire room dedicated to her work with a large, polished table, a comfortable chair, and shelves filled with every color of thread imaginable. The windows overlooked a bustling street, a vibrant contrast to the sterile quiet of the Blaisdell estate. It was a place for work, but it was also a place for life. Lena's first commission under her new patronage was a series of embroidered linen for Mrs. Crawford's personal collection. She did not dictate the designs but simply said, "Tell me a story, Lena." And so, Lena wove tales into the fabric. She stitched a detailed map of the alleyway where she had lived, the humble storefronts and cobblestones rendered with meticulous care. She embroidered a scene of a child playing with a toy boat in a puddle, a memory from her own childhood that she had always held close. Her work, once a tool of silent protest, was now a joyful expression of her own experiences and a celebration of the world she saw with her own eyes. Word of her talents spread through a different kind of network, not the society gossip of the Blaisdells, but the quiet, appreciative circles of true art connoisseurs. Mrs. Crawford showed Lena's work at her private gallery, and people were captivated. They saw the soul in her stitches, the life in her threads. She was no longer just the girl who made that veil. She was Lena the artist. She began to receive commissions from people who saw the value in her work, not her station. They did not care about her past, they cared only about the beauty and truth her hands created. Meanwhile, the Blaisdells' perfect world had begun to unravel. The wedding scandal was not a passing fancy, but a stain on their reputation that refused to fade. Mrs. Blaisdell's attempts to spin the veil as a misguided artistic statement were met with knowing smiles and thinly veiled mockery. The Crawfords, though they had handled the incident with grace, were quietly but firmly distancing themselves. Sterling, who had saved the veil from the fire, now held a respect for Lena that was a silent judgment on his own family. He saw the hypocrisy, the casual cruelty, and the unyielding arrogance that had defined his future in-laws. He was a man of good manners, but he was not without a conscience. The loss of face at the wedding had a ripple effect. Mr. Blaisdells' business associates, people who valued discretion and decorum above all else, began to pull away. The talk was not of a business blunder, but of a moral failing. You could lose a fortune and still command respect, but you could not treat people so callously and expect to be trusted. The Blaisdells found themselves excluded from the very circles they had so desperately tried to impress. Their grand house, once a symbol of their success, now felt like a gilded cage, filled with a silence more deafening than any public scandal. One day, while running a small errand for Mrs. Crawford, Lena found herself on the same street as a grand department store. She was walking with a purposeful stride, her new life a steady rhythm in her feet. As she passed the storefront, she saw Evelyn, emerging from a fitting, a disgruntled expression on her face. Their eyes met across the crowded street. It was the first time they had seen each other since the wedding. Evelyn, once a whirlwind of demanding energy, now looked tired, her shoulders slumped. Her clothes were still expensive, her hair still perfectly styled, but the light was gone from her eyes. She saw Lena not as the ghost she had been, but as a person, a free woman standing on her own 2 feet. And in that moment she saw the full weight of her own loss. She was a woman who had everything, yet she was bound by the very rules she had never questioned. She had her perfect life, her perfect husband, her perfect house, but the veil, her veil, was a constant, silent accusation, a reminder of the one thing she could not control, and of the one person whose art was so much more powerful than her privilege. Lena, meanwhile, felt a wave of empathy, not of superiority. She had no need for revenge. Her art was her freedom. She gave Evelyn a small, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of quiet acknowledgement, and then she continued on her way. She did not hurry. She did not look back. The story of the Blaisdell wedding, of the wealthy bride and the shocking dress, became a legend in the city. But the final chapter was Lena's alone. She had not only sewed a masterpiece, but she had woven a new life for herself, stitch by stitch. The hands that had once served were now free to create, and the truth they had revealed was the foundation of her beautiful, unwritten future. Dear viewer, if you've watched up to this point, thank you for your support. I have a small request. If you enjoy my stories, you can subscribe to the channel, and don't hesitate to share your thoughts about the stories in the comments. Enjoy watching. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and like the video.